4 tourists were harassing a royal guard, touching him, mocking him, filming for their vacation videos. Dozens of people watched from behind the barriers. Security held back, following protocol. Then they crossed the line. That's when a little boy's voice cut through the forecourt. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. "Guardsman, I order you to address it." The guard moved. The crowd froze, and only then did they realize the voice belonged to Prince Louie. Now, before we show you exactly what happened, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Late spring mornings in London carry that particular quality where even the air around Buckingham Palace seems to hum with ceremony. The cream-coloured stones catch sunlight and throw it back in warm waves, while the black and gold gates gleam like they'd been polished that very morning. At 10:30, the iron railings were already 3 deep with tourists. Cameras everywhere, phones held at every angle, proper lenses catching the light. The crowd pressed forward with that peculiar mix of excitement and reverence you only see at places where history isn't just remembered, but actually performed. Somewhere beyond the main courtyard, brass instruments began their familiar warm-up. Deep, resonant notes that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. The sound rolled across the square like an announcement. Something significant was about to begin. Boot heels joined the rhythm, sharp and precise, the kind of sound you could set your watch by if you'd grown up hearing it every day. But not everyone was pressed against the public barriers. Off to one side, separated by a discreet length of chain, and the quiet presence of 2 royal protection officers. A much smaller group stood in a section most visitors never even noticed. No cameras pointed their way, no tour guides gestured in their direction. The space itself seemed to command a different kind of attention, respectful distance rather than eager approach. At the centre of this protected area stood a boy who looked like he'd stepped from a formal portrait. 7 years old, maybe 8. His navy blazer tailored perfectly. White shirt, crisp, shoes reflecting the cobblestones with mirror-bright shine. Hair parted with precision, not a strand out of place. He stood with small hands clasped behind his back. Not stiffly, but with quiet confidence. Yeah, what struck you wasn't his formal clothes, but his attention. While other children might have been fidgeting or asking questions, he watched the forecourt like he was studying for an exam that mattered. His eyes tracked the positioning of the guards, the alignment of their rifles, the precise spacing between ceremonial posts. Beside him, a tall woman in a charcoal suit kept her own gaze forward, occasionally glancing down at her young charge, but never in a way that suggested worry. Her role was clearly to observe and advise, not to hover. The 2 protection officers maintained their own careful balance, close enough to respond instantly to any threat, far enough away to avoid the impression that the boy needed constant supervision. The first column of guardsmen appeared at the far end of the courtyard, and a ripple of excitement passed through the tourist crowd. Cameras went up. Voices dropped to respectful whispers. Here they came. 24 men in perfect formation, their bearskin hats adding impressive height to already tall figures, scarlet tunics blazing against the pale stone backdrop, like something from a storybook that had somehow stepped into real life. Behind them, the regimental band struck up a march that had been played for longer than most buildings in London had existed. The melody filled every corner of the square, bouncing off ancient walls and settling into the bones of everyone present with the kind of authority that made you understand why empires had once been built on moments exactly like this one. But the boy's attention had already drifted away from the main spectacle. Something else had caught his eye. A single guardsman already at his post near the south side of the forecourt, standing with the kind of absolute stillness that most people couldn't maintain for 5 minutes, let alone the hour plus required for ceremonial duty. The man stood with his rifle angled precisely at his side, left hand steady against the wooden stock, right arm locked at a perfect 90 degrees. His scarlet tunic showed not a single wrinkle, gold buttons aligned with mathematical precision down his chest. The bearskin hat cast his eyes in shadow, but something in his bearing suggested intense awareness. Not the blank stare of someone trying to look decorative, but the focused alertness of a professional doing serious work. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying the guard with the kind of concentration adults usually reserved for problems they were being paid to solve. Whatever had attracted his interest, it wasn't the impressive uniform or the ceremonial precision. It was something happening in the crowd, gathered directly in front of the guard's position. Something that didn't quite fit the respectful atmosphere of the morning. Guardsman Daniel Havers had been standing at his ceremonial post for 37 minutes, his body settled into the familiar ache of extended stillness. The bearskin hat cast his eyes in shadow, scarlet tunic catching light whenever the sun slipped past a cloud. From 20 feet away, he looked like exactly what tourists expected. A living statue, impressive but decorative. They had no way of knowing that behind the ceremonial stillness, Havers was working harder than most people at desk jobs. Before the red tunic and palace postings, he'd worn desert camouflage in Afghanistan, where standing still meant staying alive. 2 deployments had taught him to read environments the way others read newspapers, quickly, thoroughly, with understanding that missing details could have consequences beyond embarrassment. A roadside incident that had earned him the metal plate in his left knee had eventually led to his reassignment to ceremonial duties. He'd accepted it without complaint. Ceremonial duty was still service, still demanding, still important. And sometimes that duty included dealing with people who didn't understand or didn't care about the boundaries they were crossing. Right now, his attention was increasingly focused on a particular cluster of voices near the barrier directly in front of his position. 4 people, talking louder than the ambient noise level, their conversation punctuated by laughter that had a sharp edge to it. Not the warm amusement of tourists enjoying themselves, but something more pointed, more deliberate. He couldn't turn his head to look directly at them. Protocol was absolute about maintaining position and focus, but years of operational experience had taught him to gather information without obvious observation. American accents, middle-aged, the kind of casual confidence that suggested they were used to being the loudest voices in whatever room they entered. They'd been building towards something for the past few minutes, their commentary growing more pointed, their laughter more frequent. Havers could feel the shift in the crowd around them. Other visitors stepping back slightly, creating space, the way people instinctively did when they sensed confrontation approaching. His grip on the rifle stock tightened almost imperceptibly. His breathing remained steady, controlled, professional, but his mind had shifted into a different gear. The heightened awareness that came when a situation was moving from observation to potential action. Most disruptions resolved themselves. People got bored, moved on, found other entertainment. But sometimes they escalated. And when they did, Havers needed to be ready to respond with exactly the precision his training had instilled. Enough to resolve the situation, not enough to create a larger problem. The 4 Americans had the unmistakable look of people deep into a European vacation. Each wore lanyards heavy with laminated tickets and maps. The kind of organised touring that meant 6 cities in 8 days and photographic evidence of every monument. The tallest, a man with deep tan and broad shoulders, had claimed prime position at the front barrier by planting his elbows on the iron rail. His polo shirt was aggressive red, khaki shorts pressed that morning. "Look at this guy," he said, gesturing toward Havers. "Hasn't moved once since we got here. What's that been, 10 minutes? His leaner friend grinned, adjusting his baseball cap. "Maybe he's not real, like one of those wax museums." The blonde woman with the oversized camera aimed it directly at Havers's face, clicking enthusiastically. "God, he really doesn't move at all. Mike, get in there with him." The brunette was filming with her phone. "This is so cool. It's like having your picture taken with a really expensive robot." Around them, other tourists were beginning to take notice. Not of the guard, who was simply doing his job, but of the Americans, whose voices were rising above the respectful murmur that typically characterized crowd behavior at ceremonial events. A British couple with guidebooks exchanged looks that clearly communicated shared disapproval. An elderly man in a perfectly pressed suit shook his head and muttered something to his wife about proper behaviour. But the Americans seemed either oblivious to the social cues or simply uninterested in modifying their approach. If anything, the attention seemed to encourage them. The tall man decided to take things a step further. He shifted his weight forward until he was leaning far enough over the barrier that his shadow fell across Havers's polished boots. "Hey there, soldier boy," he called out, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the immediate area. "You hearing us out here?" Havers didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, his breathing steady, his posture unchanged. The absolute stillness that marked professional ceremonial training. "Oh, he hears us," the lean man said with a laugh. "He's just not allowed to say anything. It's like some kind of performance art, right? Living statue kind of thing." The blonde woman lowered her camera long enough to study Havers more closely. "I wonder if they're allowed to blink, or scratch their noses. What happens if he has to sneeze?" "Let's find out," the brunette said, still filming. "Maybe we can get him to crack." From the restricted viewing section, the boy in the navy blazer had gone very still. His aide noticed the change immediately. The subtle shift in posture that indicated focused attention rather than casual observation. She glanced toward the American tourists, then back at her young charge, recognizing the signs of someone making calculations about a developing situation. One of the protection officers had noticed as well. He took a small step closer, not intrusively, but near enough to intervene if the boy decided to act on whatever he was thinking. Protocol was clear about maintaining appropriate distance from public disturbances, but protocol also had to account for the fact that royal children didn't always think like security professionals. The boy said nothing, but his hands, clasped behind his back, had tensed slightly. The tall man decided to escalate. He reached into his pocket and produced a handful of coins, tossing them toward Havers's feet. Metal clattered against ancient cobblestones with sharp, discordant sounds. A collective intake of breath came from nearby observers. Someone said, "Oh, come on," in genuine offence, but no one stepped forward. Havers remained motionless. The coins lay scattered around his boots like pathetic offerings. The lean American, emboldened, began making exaggerated saluting motions. "10 hut! Present arms!" Each command delivered with theatrical volume and obvious disdain. The blonde woman switched to filming. "This is going to be hilarious when we show everyone back home." That's when the tall man made his critical error. He hooked one leg over the barrier's lower rail and leaned forward until his upper body was clearly within the ceremonial space. "Come on, pal," he said, reaching toward Havers with obvious intent to make contact. "Just give us a little something." The boy in the restricted section took one deliberate step forward. His voice, when it came, wasn't raised. Didn't need to be. It carried across the forecourt with the kind of clarity that made everyone in earshot turn their heads, because it was the voice of someone who had been taught that authority didn't require volume to be effective. "Guardsman," he said, the single word cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Address it." The effect was immediate and electric. The crowd went silent. Not the gradual quieting that comes when people realize something interesting is happening, but the instant, complete stillness that follows when everyone present understands they've just witnessed something significant. The Americans froze mid-motion, confusion replacing confidence on their faces. The tall man, still partially over the barrier, blinked rapidly as he tried to process what had just happened. For Daniel Havers, the words hit like a parade ground command from his commanding officer. Clear, direct, unmistakable. Not a suggestion, not permission, an order. He moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body had been trained to respond before his mind finished processing commands. His left hand released the rifle stock, swinging up to clamp over the tall American's wrist with enough force to make the man gasp. With a sharp, controlled twist, Havers broke the contact and stepped forward into the narrow space between the ceremonial post and the barrier. "Step back," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. The tall man stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock. "Whoa! Hey, we were just—" He didn't get to finish. The lean American, perhaps thinking to defend his friend or salvage their collective dignity, moved in from the side and shoved Havers' shoulder with both hands. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. Havers had been pushed by insurgents in Afghan compounds who were genuinely trying to kill him. A tourist's indignant shove barely registered as an inconvenience. He pivoted with the motion, using the man's own momentum against him. His right foot hooked behind the American's ankle, while his left hand guided him down to the cobblestones in a controlled arc that looked almost gentle, until the man hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs in a single, sharp gasp. The crowd erupted in scattered gasps and exclamations. Phones that had been casually documenting the ceremony were now capturing something entirely different. The blonde woman stepped forward, her voice rising with indignation. "You can't just attack us. We're tourists. We have rights." "Step back," Havers repeated, this time with enough steel in the tone to freeze her mid-stride. The brunette, perhaps deciding she was braver than the evidence suggested, tried to circle around toward Havers' flank while still filming. He shifted instantly, the barrel of his rifle angling just enough to create an unmistakable barrier without actually pointing at her. She stopped short, her phone trembling slightly in her grip. 20 seconds earlier, they had been the loudest, most confident voices in the forecourt. Now they stood in stunned silence, breathing hard, looking back and forth between the immovable figure in scarlet and the quietly watching crowd that had suddenly become very interested in their situation. Palace security were already in motion, their boots striking stone in a quick, purposeful rhythm that suggested extensive training in exactly this type of incident. The forecourt seemed to have contracted around the confrontation, every sound sharper. The wind against the flags, the distant clatter of the ceremonial rifles, the controlled breathing of a man who had just broken hours of ceremonial stillness because someone with authority had told him to. Havers held his position until the first security officer reached his side. Only then did he ease back, rifle returning to its ceremonial angle, stance resuming its perfect stillness, as if the last 30 seconds had been a brief intermission in an otherwise uninterrupted performance. The Americans, however, looked like people who had just realized they'd wandered into something far more serious than they'd understood when they'd started their little performance. Palace security arrived with purposeful strides. The lead officer assessed the situation with quick efficiency. Scattered coins, Americans still on the ground, others frozen near the barrier, Havers back in ceremonial position. "Report," he said to Havers. 4 individuals interfered with a posted guard during ceremonial duty. Physical contact was initiated. Response was authorized and executed." The word authorized carried particular weight. The tall American tried to regain control. "Look, we didn't mean any harm. We're just tourists." "Sir, you'll need to come with us," the officer interrupted politely but firmly. "We haven't done anything wrong." "You made unauthorized contact with a royal guard during ceremonial duty. That's a violation of palace security protocols." As they began moving toward the gates, the brunette protested. "We didn't know the rules." "Ignorance of protocol isn't a defense." The blonde woman looked back toward the forecourt, her gaze finding the boy in the navy blazer. "Wait, who is that kid? Why did the guard listen to him?" The security officer's voice carried clearly. "That's His Royal Highness, Prince Louie of Wales." The Americans stopped walking entirely, turning to stare. The remaining tourists began murmuring, pieces clicking into place. "Prince Louie, the youngest one. That's why the guard moved. He gave the order." They had spent 15 minutes mocking a royal guard in front of a member of the royal family, the same family whose face appeared on the currency they'd thrown at the Guardsman's feet. "Move along, please," the security officer said, his tone unchanged, but his meaning clear. This time they moved without protest. The gates closed behind them with a heavy, final sound that seemed to draw a line under the entire incident. The forecourt breathed again, but differently than before, with a new awareness of where they were and what they were witnessing. The ceremony continued around them. The band played on. The guards maintained their positions with unchanged precision. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere, something that would colour the rest of the morning for everyone who had been present to witness it. Near his ceremonial post, Havers had returned to his perfect stillness. To a casual observer, nothing about his bearing suggested that anything unusual had occurred. But those who had watched carefully might have noticed that his breathing had shifted into a different rhythm. Not the mechanical steadiness of someone performing ceremonial duty, but the controlled calm of a professional who had done exactly what was required and was satisfied with the result. From the restricted section, the boy who had initiated everything with 2 precisely chosen words continued his observation of the ceremony. His hands remained clasped behind his back. His posture hadn't wavered, but his gaze, when it settled on Havers, carried something that might have been approval or gratitude, or simply the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen a job done properly. The aftermath unfolded with the controlled efficiency that suggested extensive experience in managing exactly this type of situation. Additional security personnel appeared at strategic points around the forecourt. Not dramatically or obtrusively, but present enough to remind everyone that palace grounds were serious places where serious rules applied. The remaining tourists seemed to absorb the lesson without requiring explicit instruction. Voices dropped to more respectful levels. The barriers were treated with new reverence. Children were kept closer to their parents, and adults checked their own behaviour with the sudden awareness that actions here carried consequences they might not have considered. The boy in the navy blazer waited several minutes before making his move. When he did, it was with the same deliberate precision that had characterised everything else about his morning. He stepped forward from the restricted section, his aide moving with him but maintaining respectful distance. He walked across the forecourt with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking softly against the ancient stones. When he stopped, it was directly in front of Guardsman Havers, close enough for conversation but far enough to respect the ceremonial space. "You acted properly," he said, his young voice carrying clearly in the quiet that had settled over that section of the square. Havers couldn't break his ceremonial stance to respond, but something in his bearing shifted. A subtle relaxation that suggested he'd heard and understood. "Sir," he replied simply, the single word carrying more weight than a longer speech might have managed. The boy nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and dismissal. He turned and walked back to his position in the restricted section, resuming his observation posture, as if the exchange had been just another part of the morning's education. His aide leaned down slightly when he reached his place. "That was well handled, sir." "It needed to be done," the boy replied without looking up. "Your parents will want a full briefing when we return." "I expect they will." Around them, the ceremony continued with its timeless precision. The band played music that had echoed off these same walls for generations. The guards moved through formations that had been perfected over centuries. But everyone present now understood that they weren't just watching a performance. They were witnessing the continuation of something living, something that still commanded respect and still had the power to enforce that respect when necessary. As the final notes of the march faded and the ceremony concluded with its traditional precision, the crowd began to disperse. But the conversations were different now, more thoughtful, more aware of what they had witnessed and what it meant. A young woman who had been filming earlier put her phone away entirely and watched the guards' final movements with attention that had nothing to do with social media. An elderly couple who had witnessed the entire incident spoke quietly to each other about respect and tradition and the proper way to behave when visiting places that mattered. Near the front barrier, a boy about Prince Louis's age stood with his parents, asking questions about the guards and their duty and why it was important to treat them with respect. His parents answered with the kind of care that suggested they understood this had been an educational moment that would stay with their son longer than most vacation memories. The forecourt gradually returned to its normal rhythms, but not unchanged. Something had been demonstrated here that couldn't be undone. A line had been drawn, tested, and firmly re-established, and everyone who had been present understood that they had witnessed something significant, not just in terms of royal protocol or ceremonial tradition, but in terms of what respect looked like when it was both earned and enforced. Prince Louis remained at his observation post until the very end, watching the guards complete their duties with the same focused attention he had brought to the entire morning. When the last ceremonial movement had been completed and the forecourt had returned to its normal state, he finally allowed himself to be escorted back to the waiting vehicle that would return him to Kensington Palace. As they walked toward the car, his protection officer spoke quietly. "You handled that situation with considerable authority, sir." The boy considered this. "Someone needed to." "Yes, sir, they did." The drive back through London's familiar streets was quiet, but it was the comfortable quiet of a job well done, rather than the nervous silence that might have followed a different kind of incident. The boy sat in the back seat, watching the city pass by through tinted windows, processing what he had experienced and what he had learned about the weight that came with the words he was empowered to speak. By the time they reached Kensington Palace, word of the morning's events had already arrived ahead of them. The Princess of Wales was waiting in one of the private family rooms, her expression calm but alert in the way that indicated she'd been fully briefed on what had occurred. "Tell me what happened," she said simply, settling across from her youngest son. Prince Louis recounted the morning's events without drama or embellishment. The harassment of the guard, the escalation to physical contact, his decision to intervene, and the decisive action that followed. His voice remained steady throughout, his pace measured, his description factual rather than emotional. When he finished, his mother was quiet for a moment before responding. "You gave an order to a royal guard without consulting security or seeking permission." "Yes." "That's not typically part of the protocol for observation visits." "No, it isn't." "But you felt it was necessary." The boy met her gaze directly. The situation required intervention. No one else was acting. Catherine nodded slowly. "Your grandfather wants to speak with you about this." "I assumed he would." "He's not displeased. He's curious about your reasoning." For the first time that morning, Prince Louis allowed himself a small smile. "I can explain my reasoning." "I'm sure you can," his mother replied, and her own smile suggested that she already understood more about her son's developing character than his years might have indicated. The following morning, Guardsman Daniel Havers found himself standing at attention in an administrative office rather than at a ceremonial post. Across the desk sat his commanding officer, a man whose experience with unusual situations had taught him the difference between necessary action and problematic deviation from protocol. "You broke ceremonial position on the direct order of a 7-year-old, the officer said, consulting the file open in front of him. "On the direct order of His Royal Highness Prince Louis," Havers corrected respectfully. "Who is 7 years old?" "Yes, sir." "And you felt this order superseded standard ceremonial protocol?" "I felt that when a member of the royal family issues a direct command during a security incident, that command takes precedence over standard operating procedures, sir." The officer leaned back, studying Havers with the kind of attention reserved for complex problems that didn't have simple solutions. "You're not wrong about the chain of command, but you're also not technically correct about a minor royal's authority to issue operational orders." "No, sir, but the situation required immediate resolution, and the order provided clear authorization to act." "And you have no regrets about your response?" "None, sir." The officer closed the file and was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. You're being reassigned. Havers felt his stomach tighten, but his expression remained neutral. Yes, sir. Royal Close Protection Rotation, personal security detail for the Wales family. They specifically requested you. The words took a moment to register. Sir? Seems you made quite an impression on a young prince who has a very good memory and apparently strong opinions about the people he wants around his family. The officer stood, extending his hand. Congratulations, Guardsman Havers. You've just been promoted to one of the most selective assignments in the service. A week later, the forecourt outside Buckingham Palace hosted another changing of the guard ceremony. The same ancient stones, the same ceremonial precision, the same mixture of tourists and locals gathering to witness tradition in action. But something had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The crowd was more respectful, more aware of the boundaries that existed for reasons beyond mere pageantry. Tour guides made specific mention of appropriate behaviour during ceremonial events. Security maintained a more visible presence, not oppressively, but enough to remind everyone that this was a working palace where real business was conducted by real people. Near the front barrier, a family with young children stood watching with obvious fascination. The father pointed toward the guards and explained quietly about duty and service, and the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of whether they were allowed to respond to discourtesy. Why can't they talk back to people who are mean to them? His daughter asked. Because they have more important things to do than argue with people who don't understand what their job really is, he replied. But that doesn't mean no one is watching out for them. In the restricted royal section, Prince Louie stood once again in his navy blazer, hands clasped behind his back, observing the ceremony with the same focused attention he'd brought to the previous week's events. But this time, his presence carried additional weight, not just as a young royal learning about duty and tradition, but as someone who had demonstrated that royal authority, properly exercised, still meant something in the modern world. The ceremony proceeded with its timeless precision, but everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that were both ancient and alive. Something that commanded respect, not just because of its history, but because of its continuing relevance to people who still believed in concepts like duty, honour, and the willingness to stand up for others when standing up was what the situation required. As the final notes of the regimental march echoed across the forecourt and the guards completed their ceremonial duties, scattered applause rose from the crowd, not the enthusiastic clapping that might follow a performance, but the respectful appreciation that follows when people recognise they've witnessed something genuinely meaningful. Prince Louis watched until the very end, his young face serious but satisfied. He had learned something important about the weight of words and the responsibility that came with the authority to speak them when speaking mattered most. In the quiet that followed, everyone present understood that they had been part of something significant. A reminder that respect was still expected, that boundaries still existed, and that some traditions endured not because they were old, but because they represented something that still had value in a world that often forgot the importance of treating others with dignity. What would you have done if you'd seen those tourists harassing the guard? Do you think Prince Louis was right to give that order? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up when no one else would? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss moments like this. Share this with someone who needs a reminder about what real authority looks like when it's used properly. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over. Sometimes the most powerful words are the ones spoken by those who understand exactly when speaking is necessary.